The next section, he says, is to look at or to examine the rights of the wife over the husband. So basically, what the husband is obliged to do. And so the man in the marriage, the husband, he has a number of things that he should take into consideration, a number of manners, etc. And he mentions 12 things here. The first is the walima. The walima, which is the post ceremony party, if you will, which is really a public announcement. It says mustahabba. And this is a way in which you can publicize your wedding. And so this is the job of the man, to handle the walima. Of course, if someone else wants to chip in, then that's all good and swell, but it is the man's duty to handle the walima. The next thing is to be well-mannered. He says that you have good manners with your wives, if you have wives, or with your wife, and that you are patient with your wife when it comes to her temperament. There's actually a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. This hadith is reported Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Istawsu bin nisa'i khayra." It essentially means be good to your wives. He says that they were created from a rib, and the most crooked of that rib is the top of it. I'm going to explain what this means, because sometimes people are confused by this. If you let it stay crooked, no, he says if you try to straighten it, you're going to break it, and if you leave it, then it'll stay crooked. So treat women well. This is in Sahih Bukhari. Okay, so the authenticity of it is the best. Imam Ibn Hajar explained this hadith. What does it mean from the bent rib? And the top part of it is the most crooked. So, of course, we know the story of Adam and his spouse Hawa, that Hawa was created from the rib of Adam. And so this has a reference to that. But what is the top portion? Imam Ibn Hajar, he says the top portion is the tongue. The most crooked part is the tongue, in that things can be said that the man has to be patient with, has to cope with, has to kind of just ride it out. Just because if you try to straighten that, you're going to break it. And what's meant by breaking it is meaning divorce. If you try and straighten that, it's going to end in divorce. And there are numerous other hadith that talk about, the pitfalls of the tongue, etc., etc. And, so it's something that has to be taken into consideration. And then, of course, if you leave it, then it will remain as it is. So you have to be good to women folk. That means that you have to do what you can in order to, if there's anything that's said that's inappropriate or hurtful or whatever it may be, you try your best to deal with it in a nice manner. But at the same time, you can't expect perfection. Just like you wouldn't want your spouse, your wife, to expect perfection from you at the same time. He says that you should know that good manners is not by withholding harm from them, or we say good manners isn't by not harming them. Right? That doesn't mean you have good manners. Say, well, I don't beat you up. Yeah, no, and we're having a workshop tomorrow on domestic violence, and I'm interested to see what will be presented there. And there is some topic coming up that may be addressed then, as it will be tonight. So, somebody says, well, look, I don't beat you up. That doesn't mean you have good manners. A person can be abusive and can be ill-mannered to their spouse even though they're not hitting them, or they're not physically harming them, or even that they're not harming them in any way. They're just kind of there. They're there physically but absent in every other way. They could be abusing them emotionally or whatever it may be. He says, what is good manners is that he says ihtimal al-adha minha, is that you're able to cope with any harm that she does to you. That's good manners. Is that you can absorb whatever harm you receive, or whatever, you know, ill temperament or manners that are displeasing. You can kind of absorb and deal with that, you know, in a nice way. That you can be forbearant when it comes to her anger or you know, anything of that nature, as was the manner of the Prophet ﷺ. So it was reported as Sahihain. It's reported in both Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim. That, and this was reported by Omar, and this is a very long hadith, and I will send it to the group at a later date, maybe tomorrow or so you could read the hadith in its entirety. Umar ibn Khattab, he said that the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, they used to complain to him, if you will, or talk back to him, is better to say. They would talk back to him, the Prophet ﷺ. This is Omar, and his daughter was married to the Prophet ﷺ, Hafsa. And so when there was some news that he got, when he heard that this was the case, he became very, very worried because of his daughter. Said, and he found this out through his friend, and this was during the time that many of the companions thought the Prophet ﷺ divorced all of his wives, like in one swift blow. And he was worried that his daughter was among them. But when he heard about this, he said that the women of the Prophet ﷺ, they talk back to him. And some of them will go an entire day and night without being with him. They'll kind of like boycott him. You imagine? They would boycott him for a day. And so Omar heard this, radiallahu anhu, and he went to his daughter and he confronted her and asked her, are you talking back to the Prophet ﷺ? And this is what I've heard. He said, do not adopt the qualities of your co-wives. And he was referring to one in particular, because he loves her more and she's more attractive than you are. And then, of course, the hadith goes on and he talks about how the society of Mecca and the society of Medina were very different. In the society of Mecca, which was the society of the Prophet ﷺ, and that of Umar, and that of Abu Bakr, etc., the Muhajirun, the men had the upper hand in the relationship. And in the society of Medina, it was opposite. And the women had the upper hand in the relationship. And now what was happening was they were in Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ married most of his wives when he was in Medina. And so the daughters of the Muhajirin, Umar, Abu Bakr, etc., they were kind of influenced, because they were young, they were influenced by the women of their community. And so they started to adopt these types of qualities where they would position themselves in the household with the upper hand. And they would get into arguments, and then they would, kind of withhold and refrain from being in the company of the Prophet ﷺ. But the Prophet ﷺ, he coped and he managed. It's not to say that it wasn't without incident, as is indicated in this story, that he kind of sequestered himself in the upper part of his house, and people thought that he had divorced his wives, and it was a cause of worry for the community, among them Umar ibn al-Khattab. So dealing with manners, etc., the next thing is to have fun and to be playful. These are from the manners of the husband with his wife. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ was very playful and had fun with Aisha radiallahu anha. For example, he raced her a number of times. And he said to Jabir, when he wanted to get married, he says, why don't you marry a virgin so that you can be playful and joyful with each other? Somebody young and has the temperament for that type of a thing. However, number 4 is that this has to be done within reason. Being playful and joking has to be done within reason, so as not to strip your haiba, strip your dignity as a man in front of your wife. You don't want to come off as being just an ultimate clown and a fool. overdoing the fun and the jokes and the games, you're expected as a married man to carry yourself when needed in a mature and responsible manner. And if you're constantly just playing around, then you're going to lose some of the respect of your wife, and you're going to lose some of that position that you have as being the man in her life and the man of the house. So this has to be done within reason, of course. The next thing, number 5, is to be moderate when it comes to jealousy, if you will, or I should say chivalry. You should be moderately chivalrous. And what that means is that you're not intentionally heedless to the signs of a catastrophe. Yeah. The signs of a catastrophe means that your spouse, your wife, is on the brink of stepping out of the marriage. It begins to appear that she's becoming involved with someone else, putting herself in positions where it can be a huge temptation. And so moderate chivalry means that you're not crazy jealous, but at the same time you're not happy with that. You're not satisfied with, she's very flirty and she's on the phone with anybody and everybody, and she just, it's very loose, much like you would be expected the same as a man. There needs to be this level of moderate chivalry or moderate jealousy for your spouse.
Can you tell us the Arabic word that he's using?
غيرة.
غيرة?
Yeah. Yeah. Or غيرة. There's 2 different ways. غيرة. Yeah.
What's in English?
Jealousy is hard to use. Chivalrous maybe.
Protective jealousy.
Yeah, it's kind of, like I said, it's protective. It's, that you don't like that your spouse be in vulnerable situations where they're flirtatious or they're too open with the opposite gender, that they're in positions where they have temptation, they're alone with the opposite gender for whatever reason, work, school, or otherwise. And we know that the shaitan is with 2 that are alone. And so things can happen, and it can happen to the best of people. It's not like this is something that only happens to sinners and terrible people. This type of thing can happen. This catastrophe can happen to anybody. No one is immune to this. Yeah. Number 6 is spending. As a man, you are obliged to spend on your family, and you should be fair, and you should be modest when it comes to spending. So that means you're not extravagant, but at the same time you're not miserly with your wealth. You should not withhold things for yourself and not give to your family. Like, I'm only going to eat the good food and you can eat the leftovers. I'm going to wear the nice clothes and you're going to wear the rags. Because this is something that will embitter a person. They will become angry and bitter towards you if that's how you're behaving. I get the new phone and you get the hand-me-down all the time. You get the broken one. You get the junk one. That type of a thing. Number 7 is that you learn as a man, this is important, that you learn, a married man, you learn the rulings of menstruation so that you know how to live with a woman. And we're not talking about anything, but there are a number of Islamic rulings as it pertains to menstruation when it comes to intimacy and prayer and purification, etc. And then you also teach your wife sound Islamic doctrine, right? Traditionally it was that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and later, that the halaqat al-ilm, the gatherings of knowledge, the men were the ones that predominantly attended. Some of the women did, but they were considered outliers. Most of the men were there in the scholarly circles, and then they would go home and they would teach their families, or they were expected to teach their families what they had learned. The next thing is he says that you should try and remove from her heart any types of innovations that may be there, if they are. Teach her the rulings of prayer, the rulings of menstruation, the rulings of pseudo-menstruation, and also, and he gives a very, very specific ruling, and he draws our attention to this because many women are unfamiliar with this, that if her period ceases and stops before Salat al-Maghrib, the duration equivalent to 1 rak'ah of prayer, then she has to pray Dhuhr and Asr. She has to pray Salat al-Dhuhr and Salat al-Asr. So it means like while you're on your monthly cycle, if your monthly cycle ends and there's 3 minutes or so before Salat al-Maghrib, you have to play Salat al-Dhuhr and Asr. You have to make them up because it's permitted to combine prayers. It's permitted to combine Salat al-Dhuhr and Salat al-Asr. So the time for both of those prayers is in either of the time, with whatever the right circumstances may be. And the same thing goes for Salat al-Maghrib and Salat al-Isha if the monthly menstrual cycle concludes before Salat al-Fajr. Before Fajr time, with the duration of 1 rak'ah remaining, then Salat al-Maghrib and Salat al-Isha has to be made. And he says this is something that many women they don't consider regularly. Number 8, and this is about a man who has multiple wives. He says that you have to be fair. As mentioned in the Quran, you have to be just. And justice here is talking about what you provide, housing and money and etc. But not with issues of the heart like your love for them or intimacy. This is something that you don't have in your possession. Okay? And he also says that if you want to travel, then you're going to take one of your wives. I'm not sure that this is very applicable to any of us here. However, he says if you're going to travel and you want to take one of your wives, then you should draw straws, to be fair. And whichever straw is drawn, then you let that one accompany you. The next one, number 9, is an-nushuz. And this is marital discord, essentially. And this is where I wanted to draw your attention and connect it to tomorrow's domestic violence topic. Nushuz, as was mentioned by Ibn Qudama, not the author of this, the Ibn Qudama. He said that the meaning of nushuz, or if we could say discord, is the ma'siyat az-zawj fima farad Allahu alayha. Basically, when a wife does not uphold her obligations to her husband, obligations that were prescribed by Allah. This is discord in the marriage. And so there's some manner in dealing with this. So, the Prophet ﷺ, as was hinted at before, dealt with whatever temperament or manners that he faced from his wives. Whatever they were going through, he tried to handle it in the best possible way. And the Prophet ﷺ never resorted to physical abuse. He never struck a creature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless it was on the battlefield. He did not strike. Even an animal was his way to deal with things without having to get physical. And as we know, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribes a certain method which can eventually lead to a physical reprimanding of sorts. And that has to be understood. It's not abuse, and it's not violence, and it cannot be harmful to the person. So the first thing he says is that in the event of this type of discord, where the wife is just, she's not fulfilling her duties and her obligations, then the husband is going to try and pull her back in or reel her back into, living responsibly and righteously. But he should do this in degrees, right? You're not going to go from 0 to 60 in a second. You have to go softly, use a soft touch, and you begin, with exhortation and reminders, and that can lead up to, kind of talking about negative and evil outcomes in the hereafter, takhweef, which is like to frighten someone with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described of the disobedient spouse. And if that doesn't work, then you should, you should take some time away from the marital bed, to kind of remove yourself. If speaking doesn't work, so you'll see there's a number of different modes here. If speaking is not getting across, look, what you're doing is not good, this is not right, this is not righteous, this is, this is not what Allah has prescribed. If that's not reaching your wife, then you try a different tactic, and that is that you pull away physically. You do not engage in intimacy, and so you stay away from the marital bed, if you will. Essentially, you kind of turn your back to that. And this doesn't only mean the marital bed, but you can also avoid her, by not talking. So I'm not going to talk to you, and as long as it doesn't extend 3 days, as we know is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And he says, and if none of this is of benefit, obviously before you're going to try and end the marriage with a divorce, then there's a physical reprimanding here, and he's very specific. In the Quran, it's a little bit more general. It uses the word darb, which is often translated as strike or hit. But this type of physical reprimanding is something that cannot bruise or cause harm to the body, and it can't be done in the face. And so, some of the things that we see is that this advice is not being taken, and that women are being abused, and they're being battered, and they're being hurt. And of course, this is a prescription, and it certainly might not be the right prescription for you. So if those things aren't working, you need to be wise enough to know that, look, if I go trying to take, and as some of the scholars described, a miswak and tap on my wife, if I go do that and she punches me in the face, if I think that if I do that, if I hit her with my toothbrush, like, what are you doing? And she slaps me in the face, then, avoid the toothbrush altogether. Just keep on with something else until you get the right combination of things to work out in your favor. And believe it or not, the average person, regardless of gender, male or female, they respond well to kind words and gestures of love and gestures of appreciation. And so maybe, showering that a little bit more would get you further than anything else. The next thing is looking at the age group. I'm not trying to be inappropriate, but the next thing is when it comes to intimacy, manners of intimacy. And so there are a number of things that you should be aware of, and that is considered mustahab, preferred things. And that is things like beginning with the basmala, right? That, you're going to be intimate with your spouse. There are certain prayers that can be made, much like everything else in life. He says, avoiding the qibla, facing the qibla, not being totally unclothed but covered with something, blanket or a sheet or something like that. And then, to begin, with, what leads up to it, etc. And also, to be fair, right? Intimacy, this is important, because intimacy is something that is extremely powerful in a marriage. And it is often what defines the relationship that you have with that person. It defines it to be very different than all of the other relationships, right? You can be a great friend to your father or to your brother or etc. as a woman, and as a man you can be a great friend to your sisters, etc. And you may have this very robust relationship with someone of the opposite gender that's permissible to have a relationship with, but you're not intimate with those people, right? And so intimacy has been made something very unique for married people, because it's very powerful, and it's what oftentimes holds people and binds them together. And so when you're going to be intimate, you have to be considerate of each other, and it's also a way in which you protect and preserve your chastity from going outside of the marriage and to find, to fulfill those desires and to seek that pleasure elsewhere. So it requires that both the husband and the wife are considerate of each other's needs, when it comes to being intimate. You're not selfish. You don't get in there and you get out, but you try and, make it enjoyable for everybody. Another thing, interestingly, is that, and this is where we're getting close to the end here. I don't want to go much over time. He says that from the manners of, and this is part of the manners of menstruation or the monthly cycle, is that, there were people before in the Jewish tradition that when a woman was on her period, you could not even sleep in the same bed. You were required to sleep in other beds. And I've actually seen that, where the house was set up in such a way that there were different bedrooms and different beds, and that when the woman was on her cycle, the man had to leave the room. But in Islam, and there were a number of reasons why that is, but in Islam, the menstrual cycle is very natural. It's not something that's looked down upon. It's not something that's abhorred or detested or whatever it may be. It simply prevents a woman from praying and various acts of worship, and it prevents her and her husband from intimacy. But that does not mean they cannot still enjoy each other's company in a very, very private setting. And so in order to do that, you have to take some precautions. And he says that the woman wear a waist garment, she stay clothed, like from the waist down, etc. And they can enjoy each other in that way, so long as they are not actually intimate. He mentions a couple of other things here in terms of manners, etc., and we'll save those for another time, inshallah. He does say something about contraception, and he says that contraception is permissible, mubah, mal karaha, but it's disliked. We've talked about from the aims and objectives of marriage is having families, having children, and so obviously doing that is a means to prevent that from happening.